So as Justina mentioned, I will be talking over the next 30 minutes or so on navigating climate change. And we'll be talking about the kind of climate risk, climate change work that we're doing at MathWorks, including a couple of things that we did for the customer, as well as I will talk about a few tools that we have and which we've developed, which you can use if you have MATLAB. If not, we can discuss with you how we could do better and include those tools as well for the work that you're doing if it's of interest to you. I am the Senior Industry Lead for Finance Solutions, as Justina said. I work quite a lot with the central banks as well as the financial institutions across Southeast Asia, and a lot of work is on climate risk. So in terms of the agenda, I will first talk about what is climate change, why should we really care about this topic. I will then move on to what we are doing as MathWorks on climate risk and ESG. I will then spend some time on the tools that we have for climate risk. We have only about 30 minutes or so altogether, so I wouldn't be able to cover everything in detail, but I will take a couple of things that I have seen resonate more than the other tools and explain those in detail. If there is interest in the remaining tools, then you can let us know and we'll be happy to discuss these tools with you as well offline post the conference based on your area of interest. And finally, I will talk a little bit about the partnerships that we've had in this space. So let's go to the first topic in terms of what is climate change and why should we really care about this, right? So we've all heard of climate change, global warming, polar ice caps melting, so on and so forth. So the understanding of climate change and climate risk in the eyes of finance does need some basic understanding of climate change in general. For those of you who've come from a science background, I'm sure you've probably heard of this. But for those of you who are new to this topic, just to spend a couple of minutes on this. The idea is this dashed line is basically between that and the Earth is where all of our gases get trapped and create this sort of warm zone. And all of these gases, as you can see, oxygen, nitrogen, some of the other gases are trapped in this region, creating that warm atmosphere over a period of time, making our Earth livable. Or in other words, we also call that as the ozone layer. Now, what has happened in recent times is that with the increase in pollution, with the increase in different manufacturing firms, exhaust gases, as well as a lot of automobiles that have come into play, the amount of gases that get trapped in this region and bounce around has increased, therefore increasing the heat that the Earth has to eventually endure. So overall, the average temperature on Earth has grown significantly at about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius over the last few years, last maybe 3 or 4 decades. And the idea is that over the next few years, with the regulations in place, each country has a mandate to keep this to a certain limit, that is about 2.5 degrees Celsius or no in terms of increase, using the regulations that they have to follow. Now, moving on quickly, these are the way the gases bounce around as I talked about. Now, why should we really care? Now, a lot of these discussions that I've had with clients, with my friends, all of them, it's a very polarizing topic in the sense that there are many people who really think it's a problem, like me. There are many other people who think it's just political propaganda and we shouldn't really care about it. Now, the idea is whichever side of the discussion you're on, it really doesn't matter anymore, because if you're working in the, in this entire space or in finance more specifically, there are regulations that are percolating through the economy, which basically means whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, there are regulations in place that you have to follow if you are going to be working in this financial space. And the Paris Agreement was the start point of this entire regulatory discussion. The one I mentioned about increase in temperature at an average of 2.5, that needs to be the limit for most countries. That came from the Paris Agreement in 2015. And since then, as you can see, regulations have been continuously increasing. And the most popular one, or the most recent one, a few years back, was the 2019 regulation, where the UK regulators enforced strict norms on the financial institutions, where they had to follow certain principles. Even most recently, as of June 2023, these regulations are continuously evolving. The most recent one is called the ISSB, or the International Sustainability and Standards Board, where David Carlin, who's actually an active partner or speaker at a lot of our events as well, was one of the pioneers in establishing this as well. And he, along with a group of people, have inaugurated or come up with this regulation as of June 2023, which eventually people are talking about as becoming the de facto or the go-to regulations over and above all of the other ones. So this is just a quick snapshot of what is in ISSB. So as you can see, the standard particularly applies to climate-related physical risk and transition risk. For those of you who are new to that concept, physical risk is basically involves actual physical change in climate, that is change in temperature, change in ocean surface temperature, and the physical aspects of the temperature could be rain, could be drought, all of these aspects. Transition risk by definition is how these physical risks affect the economy. So basically, if there is a drought, for example, how the country's economy in that particular year will get affected as a result of the physical risk. That is the definition of the transition risk. Now, these two have been highlighted as the most important disclosures that need to be adhered to by ISSB, which is the latest standard. And as you can see, this is directly from their definition. The idea behind climate-related finance disclosure is to understand and manage strategy for climate-related risks and opportunities. By the way, as I'm going through this, feel free to post your questions on the chat or unmute yourselves and ask me as well. I have kept some time in the end for Q&A, so we can take up those questions later, but keep those questions coming in on the chat so that I can cover those later on as well. This is another important point that I want to cover. It's called TCFD, which is basically the Task Force for Climate Finance Disclosures, which is another strongly regulated set of instructions for disclosures on climate finance. And they have multiple metrics. Okay, there's quite a few things going through in this TCFD when it comes through governance, strategy, risk management, as well as metrics and targets. Now, there's enough material online on how these details are covered. But what I will be looking at and talking about quickly is the metrics that TCFD has defined and how we as MathWorks are adhering to or actually developing tools which would help you adhere to these metrics and targets. So let's see how it is for climate finance. So these are some of the common metrics that are reported in TCFD. The most common one, as I mentioned in the initial slide, is the greenhouse gas emissions, or the equivalent of carbon dioxide emissions, which basically creates that global warming structure overall. There is energy consumption. A lot of companies use natural gas, coal, as well as a lot of these fossil fuels, which consumes a lot of energy, useful for work, but it also has a lot of emission problems, which further enhance or further give out CFC, which is called chlorofluorocarbons, into the atmosphere, which again increases the temperature, causing a problem for global warming on the planet. And there are a few others as well, like carbon intensity, climate scenario analysis, and we talked about physical and transition risk as well. So for the purpose of our discussion, we will be focusing on three things: physical risk, transition risk, and climate scenario analysis. I will show you a couple of things that we've done and also a couple of tools in this area. And for the remaining ones, if there's more discussions that are needed, we can take that up offline post this conference as well. And I will be happy to talk to you about those based on your area of interest, as I mentioned earlier. So basically, as I mentioned, this is the overall structure of this entire climate finance problem. So the physical risks, as I said, whether it's hurricanes, global warming, floods, etc., come under the climate risk drivers. The transition risk, where these physical risks affect climate policies as well as the economy, those are called the climate risk drivers. Those go into something called transmission channels, which basically means how it affects multiple companies' balance sheets, profitability, and also a few other things which are at the macro or the country level, like GDP and unemployment. Most of the macro channels are taken care by the central bank, a lot of it that I work on as well. The micro channel are primarily at the company level itself. There are quite a few institutions who have structures in place to take care of this and understand how climate risk drivers go through these transmission channels to affect their bottom line or the profitability and balance sheet. And finally, we have the microprudential risks. These are usually at the bank level, where they are looking at how climate risks affect multiple risks, most importantly credit risk, and how the probability of default across multiple institutions increases as a result of climate risk. And there are also a lot of people working on the other aspects of risks as well. Liquidity risk is another thing that a lot of banks are looking at as a function of climate risk. So in summary, there are three primary things that most companies find as a challenge. And these are some things that the regulators have communicated to us. Standardization is the biggest challenge right now. I mentioned a few regulations earlier in the slides, but as you can see, the latest one is as of June 2003, which means it's continuously evolving. And we still haven't reached a level where it is completely standardized across the globe. And that is a very big challenge because these are still evolving. Greenwashing is another problem. By definition, what greenwashing means is basically a lot of companies are focusing on writing in their reports that they are adhering to climate finance and climate regulations, but it need not be necessarily so. So that is the definition of greenwashing, where it's green washed in the report, or where they are making it look in the report like they're following climate risk and climate risk regulations, but it's not really exactly what they are doing. And there are some loopholes that they are following, which is basically also harmful in the long run. And that is another problem for which disclosures need to be standardized to understand climate risk. And finally, climate models themselves are fairly complex because there are multiple variables, as well as variables which have to be taken care of over the last 50, 60 years or so. So data when it comes to climate risk is also a massive, massive problem because they lack a robust model governance structure. And I will talk about how we as MathWorks are addressing all of these challenges in this particular order. So that brings me to the second section, which is what we are doing as MathWorks on climate risk and ESG. So some of the early work that we did is basically with a reinsurance company called Swiss Re, based out of Switzerland, where we worked with them to calculate potential loss from natural disasters. So if some of you in the life insurance space or in the insurance space as well, some of you might already be working on this. So this is something we've already done. We help them do NatCat modeling, as it's called, or natural catastrophe modeling, where they used our tools. And because our tools are primarily GUI based now, we have moved towards it, as I mentioned in the conference last year as well. We have more of GUI based coding, which auto generates codes, auto generates reports, which significantly increases your accuracy as well as your efficiency in a way. Now, in Swiss Re, for example, their development time reduced by more than 50%, which was extremely significant because it sped up their product lifecycle time, as they could focus on actual analysis as well as reporting, and also move on to the next projects without worrying too much about development time on these models. And this is a comment from the head of the Swiss Re NatCat team, global head that is, at the time, who mentioned to us that it is like a treasure chest of functions and they could easily ramp up on these functions because they don't have to spend too much time on understanding the syntax of the code and usually use these tools directly offhand once it's installed. Some of the other early work we did, this was on ESG with an investment management firm, or it also does a lot of analytics. It's called State Street Global Advisors. We helped them develop a ESG investing model based on simple R factor models. While, as Todd Bridges, who was heading the group, mentioned, while you can do a lot of this in other softwares like Python and R, this is coming directly from the client. The reason they picked MATLAB was, as I mentioned earlier, was it is much faster to do it in MATLAB without worrying about the syntax and the code. And you can make use of a lot of GUI-based tools, some of which I will show you later on. But the idea here is, again, they saved months of development time and they met their deadlines despite framework changes that happened late in the piece. And instead of running it for weeks, they managed to do it in days, which again significantly increased their project cycle time. Now, these are a couple of early work that we did before our tools even became as matured as they are right now. We're still evolving slowly, but the work that I just talked about was some of the early work that we did before our tools reached the stage where we are today. Now, after that, what we've also done is we developed something called a BRSR app. So for those of you working in this space, you might have heard of BRSR, which stands for Business and Sustainability Reporting. Now, for most regulators, this is very important. And I personally work with regulators in Southeast Asia, where we have talked about this as well as about the tool that we are developing. The idea is to have one robust tool by which they can regulate multiple institutions on their ESG and sustainability norms. Now the cycle or the structure is here on the left, where once you have sustainability reports, which all companies are now mandated to produce, they go into our app and using natural language processing and artificial intelligence, we process them in a way that helps the regulator understand whether they are adhering to the existing mandates or not. And as some of you may have guessed, while these standards are evolving, slowly but surely this app will be able to take care of these standards as long as those standards are clearly documented and mentioned to the app itself. And this is the screenshot of the app where we can do multiple sets of analytics. In the interest of time, I'm not going to cover this in detail, but if this kind of areas of interest for regulators, for consulting firms, for insurance firms, it would be great to talk about this offline as well, because there's a lot of discussion on business and sustainability reporting right now. And the fact that it can be automated makes it significantly easier for all of you to use it. And we also have multiple analytics that we can do where we can gather information from social media. We can do grievance analytics. We can do subsidiary analytics. There's a lot of features that we can do, which we're happy to discuss and show and further increase our engagements as well as discussions based on the work that you are doing for business and sustainability reporting. NLP for ESG scoring and investing. I talked a little bit about investing and ESG in one of our previous work with State Street, but that was purely based on R factor modeling, which was purely numerical. Now, what's happened of late is that with the increase in social media and a lot of unstructured and text data, there is a lot of need for natural language processing or text analytics. So what we've done is we've developed a tool where we can use natural language processing, where it processes all of the sustainability reports and comes up with something called an ESG score, which is, in other words, a risk factor score, which tells the company how much they are implementing these ESG mandates. So on the right-hand side, for example, you can see a sample from our result. So as I'm going to move this up. So for example, in this particular section, the code or the algorithm highlights that Barclays has a much higher ESG score than Bank of America. What this essentially means is that Barclays has done a much better job so far of implementing ESG standards as well as their sustainability norms compared to something like Bank of America or Capital One. Now, one thing I want to talk about in these courses, the magnitude itself has no real, uh, you know, uh, proper score. The relative score is what that matters. So there is no absolute scale that is currently defined because this is still evolving. But the idea behind this algorithm is to give you a comparative study between different companies of who is doing better than the other. But the magnitude itself, like 0.7, 0.8, doesn't really mean anything as such. It's just a way to compare different scores. And here, as I said, we read it using NLP, we perform topic modeling using Finbert, and finally rank these companies based on these ESG scores. And I can discuss this in detail again offline, as of course all of the other things I'm covering, so that if anyone is of interest in this area or anyone is working in this area, I'll be happy to talk about this more in detail. Let's move on. There are about 7-8 minutes left, so I will try to be a little quicker. So finally, I talked in the last couple of things. The BRSR was a step towards the first challenge, which is standardization. The second one was to give out better disclosures because now you're numerically quantifying it, which covers the second challenge. And finally, the third challenge that we talked about in the earlier challenge slide was better and robust model governance. What we now have in MathWorks as a tool is called MathWorks Modelscape, which helps you build executable visual models. Now, what that means is we have a robust tool that can go all the way from developing a model to monitoring it, as well as a tool to govern this entire model using and adhering to standards that are defined in the market. Some of the examples are right here. SR 11.7, for example, is in the United States. SS1/23 basically means SS1 in 2023, which is for the UK, and multiple other regulations which are across multiple countries, where our MathWorks Modelscape solutions can help you build these executable visual models, deploy them, as well as monitor them over a period of time, so that whenever you make changes, you can better structure them and continuously look at what kind of models you need to make better, what kind of models you need to structure better. So let's look at the other tools that we have. We've got plenty of other tools. If those of you who attended my conference or attended my session last year during the conference, I covered some of these. So for those of you who've not been able to do it, let us know. We'll be able to share those recordings if we have. If not, I'll be happy to cover that again offline so that you get a better understanding. But in the interest of time, we have already covered ESG scoring and ESG scoring and the BRSR app, which are the bottom two. So I will be focusing on the top two, which are the most popular ones that I've seen, the Climate Scenario Explorer and stress testing of commercial loan portfolios. But if there is interest in the middle three as well, as I mentioned, I covered this last year, but if there is interest in these three, let us know, and we will be happy to talk about it. So let's move on to the Climate Scenario Explorer. The Scenario Explorer basically is a way to play or understand how models from different environments can be used using a simple GUI that we have built at MathWorks, and add your model or code downstream to the Scenario Explorer, which then takes a lot of this data, puts them together, and helps you use that data to develop the model further. Now there are multiple tabs. Now there's something called Data Explorer, there is Search Database, and I will talk about this quickly in a bit. So this is how our Database Explorer looks, the GUI. So there is this environment tab up here where you can select the environment that you're looking at across multiple environments. The most popular one is the NGFS scenario. Now, based on the environment that you choose, you can also choose on that environment what kind of models you want, what kind of scenario you want, whether it's below 2 degrees, whether it's current scenarios, whether it's a net 0, 50 scenario, so on and so forth, as you can see in that drop-down menu. And you can also see the multiple variables that you want to play around with. And I'm just going to move quickly on this and also show you a couple of other things. Now, for all of these models that I showed you, there is something called an information tab, where if you hover over to that information tab, it will, based on what you've selected, it will show you what that exactly means. Now, in this particular example, it's talking about what is the definition of net zero 2050. Similarly, based on what you choose, whether it's model, scenario, region, it will give you an understanding of what that is. Just to show you quickly how it looks. So once you select the model as well as the variable, it plots this data here on the right-hand side at the country level, which is important to understand. We have data from multiple countries. There's Taiwan right there. So all of these countries can be plotted against each other, compared, and then pushed into a downstream model to do further analysis, as you can see here on the right-hand side. And on another tab, what you can also do is go into more granularity and understand for each of these variables and regions, how multiple variables also compare against each other. So on the right hand side here, you can actually select what you want based on the model, scenarios, variables, as well as the regions. And here you can see on what scenario you have plotted it. All of that information you can plot here, and again use that data to integrate into a model. Now, I'll just pause here and explain how quickly. Now, one example of this is if you're, let's say, using or comparing multiple scenarios here, as you can see, one option is to see, for your company, for example, is to see how these would affect your cash flow statement, or how this would affect your bottom line. Now, there are standard definitions across countries now for carbon tax. In some countries, it's $5 per metric ton of emission. In some countries, it's something else. So once you understand that from this, in terms of carbon dioxide emissions per year, you will understand how you can put that into your cash flow statement and bottom line, and understand how much tax or carbon tax you have to pay, and how much it will affect your bottom line in the long run. I see we have a couple more minutes. I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. So here are the benefits. You can explore data, you can compare data, as I said, you can visualize it, and you can also export this data into MATLAB to perform deeper analysis, and then integrate that into larger workflows, your models, economic models, credit risk models, whatever you want. And it's also seamlessly integrates with all of the tools that we have in MATLAB across all of our toolboxes, if that's what you would need. And based on which side of the finance subdomain you are, this could be useful for policy making, for financial stability, for supervisory and review, or for research and analysis. Most central banks are using it for policy making. From what I've seen, banks are also using it for supervisory review and financial stability assessment. Last couple of slides is another example that I wanted to talk about, a very popular one as well. We've also developed a tool for climate stress testing, which basically means from your loan book, what we do, we take multiple scenarios from the scenario explorer that I showed, put that and stress test that across your loan book, and try to understand how your loan book or how your loan structure changes over a period of time across these multiple scenarios, so that you can better understand how your portfolio will change and help you make a better decision on whom you would loan out to, what kind of institutions would carry higher risks, so on and so forth. This is just a quick video of the demo. As I'm playing this through, I want to talk about it with just about 2 minutes left. So this is something called XLab, where we host all of our apps on a web app server. So this idea is basically the same thing that I mentioned. So the app basically highlights what kind of scenarios you have in your existing model, what kind of market data that you have, whether it's hydro, whether it's coal, so on and so forth. You can compare the market share across countries, and you can also finally plot how your loan portfolio will change over a period of time, along with stress testing that entire portfolio for different scenarios, whether it's below 2 degrees delayed, or net zero 2050. Last couple of slides. So this is basically the universe of our climate risk and ESG with MATLAB. These are the links here are all of the tools that we have under multiple buckets. And we also have a resources or a dedicated climate risk page, which you can visit and understand more about our solutions. And we also would be happy to talk to you offline, as I said, about multiple things that we've done for your specific workflow. And I want to wrap up by saying, well, see, the fact that climate risk exists is a fact. And it's a hard problem to solve, right? So the best way to do it is partner in multiple ways. We are also not experts. We are also evolving. I'm sure a lot of you working are also nascent and evolving in this space. So we've currently created partnerships with MIT's Climate and Sustainability Consortium. But we would be happy to partner with you to help us solve these problems together so that we can make the world a better place. With that, I will wrap up my discussion. I see we're about 2 to 3 minutes over.